Today, we are unpacking the story of a man who had, hands down, arguably the greatest political resume in all of American history. I mean, on paper, this guy looked absolutely unstoppable. Yet, he is the exact same president who steered a rapidly dividing nation straight toward complete collapse. We're talking, of course, about James Buchanan. It is a really fascinating look at what happens when vast, decades-long experience meets an absolute failure to read the room.
So, you gotta ask yourself, how does a leader with the perfect resume fail so completely? Well, the crucial point is this. Buchanan suffered from a fatal, tragic flaw. He genuinely believed that he could manage deep-seated explosive moral divides by just relying on technical, constitutional rules. And as we'll see today, applying strict legalism to a country that was emotionally and morally fracturing, it was absolutely disastrous. Turns out, experience just doesn't equal relevance when the rules of the game are literally tearing the board apart.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Section 1, the perfect resume.
Born into a well-to-do Pennsylvania family back in 1791, Buchanan was a Dickinson College grad. He was known around town as this incredibly gifted debater and was, deeply learned in the law. But personally, he was tall, rigid, and leaned heavily on a very stiffly formal presentation. He famously wore this high-stock collar, wrapped super tight around his jowls, just to maintain that perfectly proper, upright posture. And interestingly enough, he also holds a totally unique place in history as the only U.S. president who never married.
Now look at this timeline. This is an absolute powerhouse of a resume. He was elected 5 times to the House of Representatives. He served as the minister to Russia. He spent over a decade in the U.S. Senate, was James K. Polk's Secretary of State, and then Franklin Pierce's minister to Great Britain. That is the whole shebang. But here is the massive irony of all this. That extensive service abroad is actually what secured him the Democratic nomination in 1856. Why? Because it literally kept him out of the country during the worst domestic crises. His political opinions were kept fairly private, making him a safe, uncontroversial choice. The core insight to take away here is that experience doesn't always equal relevance. Sure, he had the resume, but he was completely out of touch with the rapidly changing landscape back home.
Which brings us to Section 2, the constitutional blind spot.
To really understand Buchanan's failure, we first have to understand sectionalism. This was the driving force of the era. It's essentially a deep loyalty to the interests of your own specific region over the nation as a whole. And Buchanan, he completely failed to grasp this. He didn't realize how deeply sectionalism had chaotically rewired American politics. I mean, the Whig Party was utterly destroyed, the Democrats were actively splitting in two, and the brand new Republican Party was rising right out of the ashes of all this division. Buchanan mistakenly believed that the North would simply accept constitutional arguments that inherently favored the South just as long as it was, technically the law.
And that leads us to a truly stunning quote from his inaugural address. Buchanan actually referred to the fiercely contested territorial slavery question as, quote, happily a matter of but little practical importance. Can you believe that? He claimed the Supreme Court was about to settle the whole thing speedily and finally. But here is the real kicker. He already knew exactly what the court was going to say. 2 Supreme Court justices had actually tipped him off quietly about the upcoming decision. He genuinely truly thought a mere legal decree from the bench would magically erase an exploding moral crisis.
So, just 2 days after his inauguration, the infamous Dred Scott decision dropped, and it was a devastating 3-part ruling. First, the court ruled that African Americans were not citizens, and therefore had absolutely no standing to sue. Second, they ruled the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was unconstitutional, and third, they decided Congress simply did not have the power to outlaw slavery in the territories at all. Buchanan actually thought this would be the speedy, final end to the debate. Instead, it was like pouring a truckload of gasoline right onto a roaring fire.
Blind to the massive public uproar, Buchanan doubles down. He decided the best way to end the bloody, violent troubles happening in the Kansas Territory was a quick bureaucratic fix. Just urge its admission to the Union as a slave state. He completely ignored the complex human and political reality happening on the ground. And the result? A total political backfire. This move wildly angered the Republicans, and it deeply, deeply alienated members of his own Democratic Party. In the end, Kansas just remained a territory, and Buchanan's political capital was basically left in ruins.
Let's move on to Section 3, violence and stalemate. And this brilliantly illustrates how, by 1858, the entire system was completely paralyzed. The Republicans won a plurality in the House, but every single significant bill they managed to pass hit an absolute brick wall in the Senate, struck down by Southern votes.
And if, by some miracle, anything did manage to squeeze through Congress, it immediately fell victim to a presidential veto from Buchanan. House passes it, Senate blocks it, President vetoes it. The legislative branch of the United States was utterly and completely deadlocked.
As you might guess, this political stalemate inevitably spilled over into real-world violence. In 1859, the abolitionist John Brown, who had previously killed pro-slavery settlers out in Kansas, seized the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. His goal? To inspire a massive slave uprising. Well, he was captured, convicted, and executed. And at this point, the nation was operating into entirely different moral realities. To Northern abolitionists, Brown was a freedom fighter, a true martyr. But to Southerners, he was a murderer, and they saw this as absolute proof that abolitionists would use any means necessary to destroy slavery.
Which brings us to Section 4, the final paralysis.
Let's walk through the domino effect of 1860. Step 1. The pressure is so intense that the Democratic Party literally fractures into Northern and Southern wings, and each side nominates its own candidate. Step 2. The Republicans nominate Abraham Lincoln. Step 3. Because of that divided opposition, Lincoln's election is almost a foregone conclusion, and that's despite his name not even appearing on most Southern state ballots. And finally, Step 4. Rather than accept a Republican administration, Southern fire eaters start actively advocating for secession.
So faced with the literal fracturing of the United States, Buchanan steps up to the plate and delivers the ultimate paralysis. He was dismayed. He was hesitant. He publicly denied the legal right of states to secede, but in the very same breath, he held that the federal government legally couldn't do anything to stop them. I mean, just let the ridiculousness of that paradox sink in for a second. You can't legally leave, but I can't legally stop you. He desperately hoped for some kind of compromise, but the secessionist leaders simply didn't want one. Buchanan was entirely trapped in a constitutional catch-22 of his own making.
Now, he did try a brief militant tack right at the very end. After several of his Southern cabinet members resigned, he appointed Northerners in their place. He then sent an unarmed merchant ship, the Star of the West, to carry reinforcements and supplies down to Fort Sumter. But on January 9, 1861, the vessel was fired upon and driven away. And Buchanan's response? He completely refused to act further. He just threw his hands up. The great legalist had finally run out of rules to follow, and so he simply gave up.
In March of 1861, Buchanan retired to his Pennsylvania home, Wheatland, leaving this massively exploding crisis squarely on the shoulders of Abraham Lincoln. Now, in his final years, he did support the Union cause, but critics relentlessly castigated him for permitting secession in the first place. And the real tragic irony here? He seemingly learned absolutely nothing from the Civil War. Even after the war was over, he published a book defending his views of the Constitution and his actions toward the South. He died on June 1, 1868, still 100% convinced that his strict legal logic was totally sound, even if the country broke in half because of it.
So, what does this all mean for us today? When you are sitting in the highest office in the land, is strict legalism a valid excuse for inaction when a nation is literally collapsing around you? James Buchanan had the perfect resume, no doubt about it, but he fundamentally lacked the vision to see that massive moral crises require so much more than just a literal reading of the law. I'll leave you to ponder what true leadership really requires when the rules themselves are what's tearing the country apart.